270th day of the year. Today's going to be, of course, the 26th of September. I've been doing some numbers, compiling some data from what's going on in real estate to try to give you the best information currently in Santa Clarita Valley. 12 coming soon listings, 55 new. That's placed over the past 7 days. 73 properties have had their price changes. 24 have gone back on the market. 29 have gone under contract. 47 have gone deeper under contract from basically backup offer depending status. That's typically used by those agents out there and the sellers that don't want any additional inquiries or backup offers on their property. Kind of takes them completely off the table. 57 properties have closed, 6 have expired, 11 canceled, 12 been put on hold, 4 have been withdrawn from the market, not selling. One of the things, let me point out this here as I'm doing the daily numbers. So I get all the numbers, I glean them from the multiple listing service, then I create files and I convert those files depending on the large language model or the GPT that I'm using or the AI. I will then pull the information and maybe transfer that into a text file. It's just going to depend on how it can chew on the data. And sometimes when I'm pulling out full files, I get erroneous information because it's not taking into account the actual titles of the file. So it's creating issues by not correlating the data. So I have to go through several times. But the information that it gleans is quite impressive, and that definitely does help understand more about the dynamics in the market, at least what's happening currently. Now, on the other side of that, there are some folks out there that are touting to be some kind of experts in this field. This is so absolutely cutting edge. There really is nothing about being experts. It's about getting into the information and looking at it. What I did is I put a couple of things in the blog post for today. I had Chat Chew on a chat that I had put together earlier with some data, pulling out some graphical information, and in doing so it came up with this graph kind of giving an idea on what's happening in the various cities as far as properties that correspond to price per square foot. So you can see in most of these areas, Valencia is definitely priced higher than most of the other cities out here. There wasn't enough information in sold properties for Stevenson Ranch, just basically because that there aren't very many houses there for sale, and there haven't been for quite a while. Valencia is a larger area with more residences. It's not that Stevenson Ranch had the same amount of houses in Valencia. We would definitely have a different story to give you, but it doesn't. There's a lot less residential real estate in Stevenson Ranch 91381 when compared to both Valencia, and that's 91355. So that's the data. Looking at what's happened here in the last 7 days, the market snapshot, nothing exciting, nothing new. We do have the interest rate that is slowly coming down. We are now high 5s, low 6s, but it's going to depend on your ability to finance and what's going on with your own credit history. Looking at the sales and the numbers from Castaic, I had Castaic Real Estate pulled to give us some market trends, and I had that chewed on by various large language models, various AIs, to have them give us some information. I did include that on our blog post here, our blog at santaclaropenhouses.com. So you can go there, you can get that information. But what I did in doing so is I did put together this data so you can find out what's happening in the real estate market. Now, both sellers and buyers, there are some concerns. On the buyer standpoint, they don't want to overpay for anything. But in some cases, they'll come back later requesting additional information, more so than what's actually required for the repair, if that makes sense. So a real estate seller is very excited. They believe, okay, this is buyer, we're going to be starting this process. And that being the case, as they get closer to closing, there usually comes in some kind of a request for repairs, and that's going to depend on the time frame, the contractual time that you have been given as a real estate buyer to be able to do all your investigations and inspections. Part of that process is then providing some kind of a request to the seller, maybe having some kind of closing cost credit with reference to repairs, or just having the repairs completed and done outright. That's not a time that you want to renegotiate the sales price of the residence. And this happens more often than it potentially should, and maybe because buyers aren't prepared for this part of the process. Now, I don't blame somebody going out and trying to ask for everything they can possibly get. But if, and it's happened frequently, If you're a real estate buyer going into a residence and you get through the inspections, and the best the inspector has is some light TLC, some tender loving care should be taken with the house, and maybe, let's just throw this out there, and I saw this recently, 2 GFCI, the ground fault interruption outlets, those outlets that have the buttons on them that are close to water sources like sinks, by the kitchen and bathrooms, by bathtubs, those sorts of things. Those outlets are protected, and what's supposed to happen is if you have a large draw, i.e. you're taking a bath, and there happens to be one of those fancy outlets next to the bathtub, maybe next to some water source or sink, and your better half is blowing their hair dry with a hair dryer, and they decide to throw it into the bathtub because you're in there, usually that outlet, if it's plugged into GFCI, it's going to stop you from getting electrocuted because the outlet's going to pop. That's what's supposed to happen. So while the situation of needing that kind of an outlet usually isn't as dramatic as the Hollywood scene painted by a distraught spouse taking, hair dry and seeing you in the bathtub and wanting to end you, having those outlets not in working order is a good thing to get taken care of. It depends on that previous negotiation if you're going to ask for it. But asking for thousands of dollars in credit in lieu of repairs because of 2 GFCI outlets that are not functioning properly is really overdoing it. Thousands of dollars it does not cost to replace 2 of the GFCI outlets. So going into that and understanding that process is really going to be helpful from also a buyer's and a seller's standpoint. At some point, you as a buyer are probably going to be a seller, I would guess, and that's going to happen probably sooner than you've bet on. A lot of people that are buying real estate are under the presumption this is our forever home. We're going to finish here. I can't tell you how many people I've gotten calls from a few years after the forever home has been purchased wanting to sell and buy another forever home. That being the case, when you're working out this process and going back and forth, you might be in the seller's position. So just give it a moment and think about it. Instead of maybe asking for $10,000 credit because there's 2 outlets that are not working, and I'll kind of idea the outlets themselves, $20, $30, $40 just for the outlet. To have a qualified electrician put the outlet in the wall or replace the broken GFCI or the non-updated outlet to a GFCI, that's going to cost whatever an electrician would cost to come out to the property for a service call. The item itself is relatively inexpensive. More than likely, depending on the work done, you're probably going to pay more in labor, but not to the tune of thousands of dollars. I would say $100, $150 maybe to have the cat roll out the electrician and to put in the outlets, as long as like when they get there, they don't see that the wires have been burned in the wall or it's made of some kind of the box, or they upgrade the issues and say, well, it's not only these 2 GFCIs, but there's aluminum wiring or something else that could cause a major fire hazard. Now we're getting into thousands of dollars because typically wiring has to be replaced or new wiring needs to be put in, and the box or the outside electrical panel might need to be updated and changed, and all those little breakers inside. That now we're talking a lot of money, and that has occurred as well. So typically that request for repairs, it's going to be a lot more than the $50 or $200 or $300 for 2 or 3 GFCI outlets. The point is this: don't use that as a way to negotiate the price. The negotiating of the price needs to be done up front. Now, of course, you're trying to get the property, you're trying to show the seller you're on your best foot, the seller really wants to work with you, and you should really be the only offer in town. In essence, that's great, and you're going to maybe be competing with other buyers. Just make your offer solid when you get into the process. Let your agent be your guide. If there is thousands of dollars worth of damage that needs to be taken care of, more than likely the seller's going to want to do that anyway, even if their house doesn't sell to you. Maybe the seller's going to say, well, I'm not going to sell it to you because I don't like the way you're asking. So if you're going to let an emotional component get involved in a business transaction, fine. My suggestion is maybe pull back from that stance and not be so hard about it. A buyer has a right to ask, even if the buyer agreed to at the very beginning of the process, as we try to, for our sellers, get the buyers to agree to, that the seller's not going to entertain any future requests for anything. but the buyer can still make it. The seller then at that point is faced with having to either deny it, fulfill it, or maybe meet them halfway, or at least make some kind of a comment. But at that point, if the buyer decides that the seller isn't doing enough, the buyer has a choice. Whether the buyer gets their deposit back or not, that's going to depend on time frame and what documents the buyer has signed in that process to either reduce or increase particular time frames. If they have removed contingencies, let's say, and they choose to then cancel the transaction because the seller has decided not to do something that they have a choice in doing or not, and they decide to cancel, sometimes that deposit will be forfeited and become property of the seller. Knowing where you are in the process is incredibly important, and you should know that every step of the way throughout real estate, through with your guide, whether you're buying or selling on either side. This has been your real estate update for today. We are closing out this week. We're almost to October, folks. That's going to be next week, Tuesday. So we're September 2024. There have been some changes in the commission structure, at least the publicly shown commission numbers, and it's just not shown anymore. So you're not seeing that show up. The data is still present inside. And I was doing a concessions search morning to kind of get an as to what kind of money's being paid out. And you have different averages. The biggest thing that's being paid for currently is a rate buy down. So basically somebody has this 6% interest rate, but for 2 to 3 years, the buyer's actually able via the seller to have the seller maybe offer a credit, or maybe from the buyer's end of it, but a credit to be given that can be used to buy down that interest rate, at least for a short period of time. Typically, that action does not preclude or prevent the buyer from refinancing if that rate happens to drop to where that rate, the current rate is as far as their buy down, or something lower than that. So usually that's something that's offered. Is that kind of expense worth it? This is $15,000, $20,000, folks, for $750,000 or higher. It's just going to depend, and those numbers are a bit not committal, just for the fact that it's going to depend on that particular situation, what that's going to cost, your lender, the interest rate, your credit worthiness, and so on. But before you do that, that's a real good conversation to have with your professional and find out if, in fact, that makes sense to have these, 15 into the deal to your lender in order to buy down an interest rate, where that rate might actually come down to that point in the next several months. Again, opinions are like, what, everybody has one. Some people don't use them properly. I'm Connor with Honor. Thank you for watching. We'll talk to you in the next one. Please share if you have anybody out there that could use my services, and please go to www.santaclaritaopenhouses.com for more information. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for watching. I'm Connor with Honor. Over and out.